Hello, everyone. People in the room and on Zoom. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm delighted to be here. I'm part of the New York Southeast Asia Network. And before we get started in what promises to be a wonderful event, I just want to highlight a couple of upcoming events for the New York Southeast Asia Network. And for any of you who aren't subscribers to our newsletter or members, now I'm urging you to become both. But I want to highlight that on the 25th of March, there will be a book event on Walden Bello, a very important leftist Filipino politician who's published a memoir. On the 27th of March, there is an all-day conference up at Columbia on Trump and Southeast Asia with a lot of very interesting speakers, which promises to be quite good. On Wednesday, the 2nd of April, and one of our panelists today is going to be hosting a documentary film called Sexy Killers, and then have a screening and discussion with the director, Dondi Laksono, an Indonesian documentary filmmaker. And then on Friday, the 11th of April, we are having a book talk with Anne on her new book, which is called Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia. And it will be a very interesting event, I think, because the book is very interesting. And Anne is an assistant professor of communication studies at Baruch College here in New York. And over to you, Anne. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It is an honor for me to welcome you all to Professor Taomo Zhou's talk entitled An Absent Mother Between Two States, Third World Internationalism and Motherhood, and in Indonesia and China. I'm especially thrilled to be here and moderate and this discussion. When Margaret asked me to moderate this talk, I directly said yes, especially because Taomo and I first met in summer 2012. I don't know if Taomo remembers this, in a cafe in downtown Ithaca. At the time, I was just beginning, we both were PhD candidates, and I was just beginning my dissertation research. And so it's amazing to see, the evolution of both of our work, right? And all of these years. And then I feel especially grateful for this opportunity to be able to sit with Taomo and to listen to her talk and to engage with her later in the discussion. And so what's gonna happen is the format of the talk is we will have Taomo to speak for 40 to 50 minutes, and about 40 minutes, and then followed with a discussion between me and her just for a short bit. And then after that, we will open up a Q&A discussion with everybody. So folks online can also join us with their questions later during the Q&A session. Now, I'm going to read Professor Taomo's bio. Professor Taomo Zhou is an associate professor in the Department of Chinese Studies and Dean's Chair in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at National University of Singapore. Her first book, Migration in the Time of Revolution, China, Indonesia, and the Cold War, published by Cornell University Press in 2019, won a Foreign Affairs Best Books of 2020 award and an honorable mention for the 2021 Harry J. Benda Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. And I think the paperback version of this book was just released this month, right? So congratulations.
Thank you.
So those of you who don't have Taomo's book, please go ahead and order one. Taomo's second book project, entitled Made in Shenzhen, Global History of China's First Special Economic Zone, will be published by Stanford University Press. Congratulations as well. All right, everybody, please welcome Professor Zhou.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this very generous introduction. Of course, I remember our friendship trace all the way back to the coffee shop in Ithaca more than 10 years ago. So I'd like to thank Margaret for extending the invitation to me. I thank the sponsorship from New York Southeast Asian Network, and thank you all for being here, especially also the audience online. So the politics of motherhood occupy a very important place in the United States and worldwide today. In the US, debates over reproductive rights, parental leave, childcare policies continue to shape political discourse, reflecting deeper struggle over gender, labor, and the role of state in shaping families. The politics of care actually received more public attention during COVID-19 crisis, when many parents were deprived of social and communal support for childcare. So the project I'm presenting today is actually a pandemic project, in the sense that it was inspired by my own children. At the same time, they have also been my biggest obstacle in completing my research. So here you see my elder daughter, Paulina, during Singapore's COVID-19 lockdown, and she was Zoom bombing my online conferences. So during this period of intensive parenting under quarantine, I sought temporary escape by reading the diary of a fellow working mother, one with a far more illustrious career than mine. Francisca Fanggidaej was a senior cadre of the Indonesian Communist Party, or the PKI, and a member of the Indonesian parliament. She presented Indonesia at 3 conferences that marked the inflection points in Afro-Asian movements that include the Calcutta Conference in 1948, the Second Afro-Asia Conference in 1965, and the Tricontinental Conference in 1966. Beyond these, she was an active member of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, attended the Afro-Asian Women's Conference, and she contributed to the Afro-Asian Journalists Association. Her diaries were written in Bahasa Indonesia, but her notebooks were decorated with images of Zhongshan Park in Beijing and a photograph of an artwork entitled in Mandarin Chinese, "Workers and Peasants Unite." How did these elements come together? Why did she title her diary Nila III? Who is the little girl in the photo on the cover? Part of the answer lies in a letter she wrote to her daughter Sasha in 1986. Francisca left Indonesia in mid-September 1965 to attend a meeting of the International Journalist Organization in Santiago, Chile. When she said goodbye to her daughter at the Jakarta airport, she promised her teenage daughter that she would return within a week. However, due to mass killings and the subsequent rise of an anti-communist military dictatorship, Francisca spent 19 years in exile in China. This included 8 years in quarantine as a patient in a leper's colony near Guangzhou or Canton in southern China. In 1985, Francisca migrated to the Netherlands, where she lived until she passed away in 2013. Through decades of forced separation from her children, Francisca held tight to a towel belonging to Sasha and a nightgown belonging to her eldest daughter, Nila. She also named her diary books Nila and Sasha. She talked to them in her diaries about things big and small in China. She carefully kept these diaries in the Chinese-style Ziploc bag you see in the lower left corner, hoping that the children will read them when they finally reunited. Francisca had been a left-wing activist touring Asia, Africa, Latin America at the height of decolonization, a foreign dignitary infected with leprosy in China during the Cultural Revolution, and an asylum seeker in Western Europe when Cold War thawed. While her public identities changed, the core of her personal identity was consistent. She was a mother, and she remained one, even while disconnected from her children's day-to-day life. During her exile, thinking of herself as a mother brought her the utmost despair, as well as hope for light at the end of the tunnel. In her diaries and letters to her family members and friends, she never stopped caring about her children. Motherhood was central to Francisca's life, despite her prolonged separation from her family. Motherhood is one of the most important, significant enduring, hotly debated, and yet mundane social institution in human society. It is also central to our understanding of the latter half of the 20th century, and particularly two historical phenomena. The first is the rise and decline of third world internationalism. This refers to the decolonizing nations campaign for autonomy during the Cold War. Historians usually recognize the first Afro-Asian conference in Bandung, Indonesia, as the beginning of these movements. Francisca was an active participant in the Afro-Asian movement. Her activism challenged the stereotypical understanding of the networks forged in this era, largely as a homosocial space. The second, starting from the late 1970s, we witnessed the decline of third world internationalism and the rise of neoliberalism. The unremunerated or poorly remunerated labor of mothers filled the gap left by market reform in socialist countries, as well as privatization and deregulation in the West. By the end of the 20th century, mothers were the primary producers, consumers, and reproducers of neoliberal world. So my talk today focuses on the arguably unnatural, unseemly, unfit mother. I will present Francisca's life story as a history of politics of maternal absence. So basically, these are state policies and discourses regarding non-residential mothers and opinions and behaviors of the mothers themselves. Throughout the processes of decolonization, the rise and decline of third world internationalism, and the end of the Cold War, revolutionary, totalitarian, and neoliberal states alike, they constructed and mobilized this category of absent mother to establish or maintain political order. The state's gender policies, reproductive policies, welfare provision had a significant impact on the public and self-perception of mothers who are living away from children, including whether they should be condemned, condoned, or celebrated, for what cause, for what causes, and under what conditions. Although exempt from the day-to-day physical labor of childcare, faraway mothers like Francisca were often consumed with equally, if not more taxing, emotional labor of coming to terms with mother-child separation. Be it guilt, relief, or rationalization, their responses were shaped by the historical contexts where they were situated. So what they expatriated, exiled, or estranged mothers experienced in their inner worlds shed light on how different states frame maternal differences in different ways to engineer the political, social, and economic transformation they envision. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sources I use and the research methodology. Based on Francisca's diaries across 4 decades, more than 180 personal letters, as well as her memoirs and oral history interview with her children and the extended family, my research analyzed the historical forces that led to Francisca's absence as a mother. So it's not just the geopolitical circumstances that caused her physical family separation, but also the socially constructed process by which she was disqualified and delegitimized as mother. To that end, I would like to briefly discuss 3 phases in Francisca's life in which she experienced motherhood differently. So first, let's start with accounts based on Francisca's memoir about her early life. So I'd like to zoom in one day. This is in December 18th, 1948. Francisca was 5 months pregnant with her first child, Nila. At the time, she was imprisoned in a dark and humid cell in the city of Solo in central Java. There's little light, hardly any edible food in her prison cell. She wrote to her husband and fellow comrade in the PKI, who was actually incarcerated in the male section of the same prison. If they're released, she doesn't want to fight anymore. She just wanted to be a wife and mother, devote herself wholeheartedly to her husband and child. Her husband never replied to that letter. On the next day, he was executed as part of the governmental crackdown against the PKI-led armed uprising in Madiun area, or what historians call the Madiun Affair. So first, Francisca never became a home-centered mother. Throughout her life, her concerns were inherently political and social. She was born in 1925 to a high-ranking civil servant in Dutch East Indies government. As a young girl, she had access to Western education and grew up largely unburdened with household chores. Her childhood in a privileged family probably explained her passion for somehow like stereotypically masculine, right, political agenda, as well as her lukewarm attitude towards practical issues and also gender issues. So as women were mobilized to join the anti-colonial struggle, Francisca ventured into the public arena traditionally reserved for male and campaigned in Indian Europe for Indonesia's national independence. From the mid-1950s to early 1960s, her profile on the Indonesian political scene amplified and her international travels continued. So soon after the birth of her first child, Nila, Francisca was elected as the chairwoman of Pemuda Rakyat. This is the youth wing of the Indonesian Communist Party. The death of her first husband made her feel old. So she said, I'm going to retire from the youth movement. And this is the time when the Bandung Conference was approaching. She became a reporter in Indonesia's national news agency, Antara, and she remarried a co-worker, fellow journalist, Supriyo. In 1957, she became a member of the Indonesian parliament and also its Foreign Affairs Commission. So at the same time, she gave birth to 6 more children between 1955 and 1963. Despite her back-to-back pregnancies and childbirth, she actively participated in Afro-Asian political intellectual exchanges. So she flew across the globe to places such as Berlin, Cairo, and Helsinki for conferences. So I guess you're all wondering, how did she do it? Her political activism was made possible through multiple mothering, as Francisca delegated and dispersed maternal labor to king and non-king. So she's a political figure. She benefited from her privileged social economic status that allowed her to outsource domestic chores. Her second husband, the figure you see at the center of this picture, journalist Supriyo, he also shared childcare responsibilities in line with the socialist maternalist ideology that called on male and female to share care responsibilities. Supriyo spent considerable time with the children and acted like a mother. This is a quote from his daughter, one of his daughters, Santi, when Francisca was traveling abroad for work. Francisca also relied upon grassroots cooperative childcare provided by both men and women in the larger kinship, communal, and social networks, which resemble what historian Patricia Hill Collins called other mothering in African American communities. So at the time in Indonesia, the boundary between biological mother and other female caregivers was kind of fluid. To attend the inaugural Afro-Asian Women's Conference in Cairo, Francisca temporarily put her second youngest daughter, Diatini, under the care of a distant relative called Rini. Rini continued to raise the baby after Francisca's return from Cairo and eventually adopted her after Francisca went into exile. So for those who are familiar with Indonesia, Diatini is the mother of Riza Rahadian. So yeah, probably one of the top, definitely top Indonesia film star. Yes, and recently became kind of politically active. So Francisca personified the idea of militant motherhood, a concept promoted by Gowani, Indonesian women's movement. So as Dutch historian Sakia Wieringa argues, in the early 1960s, Gowani projected the image of patriotic mothers who worked shoulder by shoulder with men to oppose foreign intervention in Indonesia. Like many women in the wider Eastern camp during the Cold War, Francisca might have internalized the Marxist-Leninist idea that women's movement should be subsumed into the struggle of the proletariat. Francisca was probably the first person to alarm the international community about atrocities committed against female left-wing activists during the Indonesian anti-communist mass killing in 1965-1966. At the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, Francisca decried Suharto regime's brutal oppression of governing leaders and the tortures of the most bestial type perpetrated against women in Indonesia. So her public protests invited retribution from the Suharto government, which immediately canceled her passport. Suddenly rendered stateless on a foreign land, Francisca accepted an offer of asylum from the Chinese delegation at the Tricontinental Conference with a temporary Cuban passport, which is a gift from Fidel Castro. Francisca flew to Beijing to work with the Afro-Asian Journalists Association. In the early days of her exile in the Cultural Revolution China, on each of her 7 children's birthdays, she couldn't send birthday gifts, so she wrote them birthday stories. These are stories about Maoist revolutionary youth, such as a girl guerrilla fighter in South Vietnam or a Hong Kong teenager who was rioting against the British in 1966. These are her gifts, but she didn't write those on letters. She just wrote them in her diary books because she dared not to communicate directly with her family in Indonesia. She feared that by doing so, she will jeopardize her family's safety and security. So you might wonder now what is happening with the children. With their biological mother abroad, Francisca's children survived the mass violence by relying on the support and protection from their other mothers. So during the nationwide anti-communist campaign, Francisca's husband, Supriyo, was arrested. Her eldest daughter, Nila, took the younger children on the run. Francisca's siblings sheltered them. So one of Francisca's sister, Dali, she was Indonesia's first female consular general. She was stationed in Egypt, Cairo, but her stellar diplomatic career was cut short due to her connection to Francisca. In the 1970s, Dali sold all her belongings to purchase a house big enough to accommodate all the children. So having never married or given birth in her whole life, Dali nevertheless mothered Francisca's children. The fervent politics in Cultural Revolution China offered Francisca temporary relief for her anxieties arising from family separation. Francisca found validation that her personal sacrifices were meaningful. So due to Mao's perception, Chinese leader Mao Zedong's perception that there are imminent national security threats coming from both the Soviet Union and the United States in the late 1960s, the People's Republic China used the icon of women warriors to proclaim the urgency of war. So one of the most famous icons were the ones you see here, the female soldier spies in the modern Peking opera Red Detachment of Women. In the Chinese Communist propaganda during this time, maternal emotions were minimized relative to one's loyalty to the party, and family bonds were replaced by political and institutional ties. So during the Cultural Revolution, there was very great social demand for individuals to completely submit to the ideological authority of Maoism. When it became very clear that Beijing would not send the exile back to Indonesia as promised, and Francisca would not see her family anytime soon, Francisca did not blame the Chinese government, but denounced her longing for her husband and children as unrevolutionary, as ugly selfishness. Between 1967 and 1974, Francisca was diagnosed with leprosy and quarantined at an enclosed sanatorium near the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou or Canton. Due to the stigma associated with leprosy, she kept her condition in secret. She only informed a few close friends in the exile community. So the exact word lepra or kusta never appeared in Francisca's diary or personal letters. She referred to in Bahasa Indonesia as disunion, sakit itu, with Chinese name Ma Feng, and described it as the most feared disease in the world, rendering her an outcast physically and emotionally. So we don't know how she contracted leprosy, but it seems she suffered from a relatively mild case. Her symptoms started with acute pain in her legs. She underwent multiple surgeries to remove the infected skin lesions and was very likely prescribed Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture. So in the dominant gender ideology of Mao's China and Suharto's Indonesia, absent mothers were judged differently, but good mothers are always asexual. Sexuality and motherhood clash on in Francisca's life when she was in a leprosy asylum during the Cultural Revolution in China. In this secluded leprous colony, Francisca developed romantic feelings towards a Chinese man who was 20 years younger. Based on her description, this young man seemed more likely to have been a patient than a medical staff. And Francisca openly admitted in her diary that this young man had quote and unquote strong sexual appeal to me, and my most serious weakness is precisely in this matter. So it is highly likely that nothing physical had happened between Francisca and the Chinese young man. I think what Francisca wrote in her diary was merely her internal emotions. For Francisca, having sexual desire for a younger Chinese man had already tarnished her profile as a revolutionary woman. Francisca internalized extremely high standard for female revolutionaries. And like patterns across China and in the wider world, the sexual politics of Indonesian exiles in China favored heterosexual men. So the Chinese government had a ban which forbid exiles for forming any kind of romantic relations with the local Chinese. In other words, both male and female exile were subjected to sexual repression. But men tend to have more liberty and power in pursuing sexual opportunities, sometimes in exploitative ways. The gentleman you see here in the picture, Sobrang Aidit, he is the younger brother of the Indonesian Communist Party Secretary General Dian Aidit. He's the younger brother. So he lived in exile in China and became kind of infatuated with his daughter's classmate, who is an underage Chinese girl. So Sobrang Aidit harassed the girl to the point that the girl's parents confronted him, but he never felt remorseful or ashamed. In contrast, women with high political status, like Francisca, were often under immense pressure to uphold the chaste and demure image of an ideal revolutionary woman, because they were much more vulnerable than men to accusations of sexual impurity, which also implicate political impurity. So by 1974, both Francisca's leprosy treatment and her hopes for love had come to an end. The previous year, her relationship with the young Chinese man had begun to strain as he distanced himself in pursuit of a relationship with a young Chinese woman. Amidst these disappointments, Francisca received the good news: she tested leprosy-free. She was discharged from the sanatorium and rejoined the other exile here. This is a new settlement built by the Chinese government exclusively for Southeast Asian exiles, and it's located in the landlocked province of Jiangxi in Southeast China. So in this settlement known as the 510 compound, the exiles enjoy material comforts and a privileged social status in China. However, they remain socially isolated from the local communities and were constantly under government surveillance. So I visited there in 2013. Happy to talk about it later during the Q&A if you have any questions. In the mid-1980s, China and Indonesia began negotiations on the resumption of diplomatic ties, pressured by the Suharto regime to renounce any ties with the Indonesian Communist Party. the People's Republic of China canceled its comprehensive welfare packages to the Indonesian exiles, triggering their migration to the West. Now let's turn to the final phase of Francisca's experience as a mother when she resettled in a quiet apartment in a small Dutch town called Zeist. So from Francisca and many Indonesian exiles, migration to the West actually meant downward social mobility. She felt that her pride was offended as she begged for political asylum in the Netherlands at the age of 60. After initial struggles to learn practical life skills such as cooking, because she never needed to cook in China or back in Indonesia, she adapted to her new environment and remained politically active, particularly for international campaigns advocating for the release of Indonesian political prisoners. Francisca resumed direct contact with her family in Indonesia in the late 1970s. Her husband, Sobrio, had been released from prison, and all the children had grown up healthy with the support from her sisters and brothers. Her elder children were married and had become parents themselves. The younger ones were still studying. Her eldest daughter, Nila, named her firstborn after Francisca. However, the happy family reunion Francisca had long dreamed of did not come true in the ways she had hoped. In 1981, Francisca's oldest son, Gordon, moved to Amsterdam. The relationship between Francisca and Gordon remained distant, although they were physically close by, possibly due to A, the long separation, and B, Gordon's homosexuality. In 1994, Gordon passed away at the age of 38, very young, from HIV/AIDS. Meanwhile, before the downfall of Suharto in 1998, Francisca was discouraged from returning to Indonesia due to concerns that her visit will endanger the career of her children working as civil servants under the anti-communist military regime. As her main source of income was the allowance issued to the political asylum seekers by the Dutch government, Francisca was unable to sponsor her children's travel to Europe. Nila, the eldest daughter with the deepest emotional ties to Francisca, only managed to visit her mom in 1998. So Nila had long been suffering from illnesses, and the trip might have been planned as a last chance for the mother and daughter to see each other. Her death, which occurred a year after their reunion, was a heavy blow to Francisca. In her later years, Francisca had agonized over her long absence as a mother. Francisca's guilt can be contextualized in the global retreat of communism and the social trends towards child-centered motherhood. In Indonesia, the Suharto regime domesticated women, undermined their economic independence, and enshrined home-centered mothers as key to stabilizing the family unit. Across former Eastern Bloc, the end of the socialization of childcare reduced the rate of women's labor participation. In Western Europe and the United States, the deregulatory policies initiated by the Reagan-Thatcher era, a hallmark of neoliberalism, similarly reduced women's childcare options and reinforced a shift towards domesticity. In China, marketization and one-child policy offers some urban middle-class women more educational and employment opportunities while giving rise to intensive mothering with a focus on educational achievements. So in this context, Francisca saw her younger self as a neglectful mother who was penalized with the irreversible loss of her bonds with them. In her letters to her now adult children, she repeatedly reprimanded herself for being impatient, authoritarian, frequently resorting to physical punishment on her children. She asked for Nila's forgiveness as she often hit her harshly due to her own fatigue and stress as a single mother at the time. In her memoir, she recalled an episode in which she said she was possessed with demon and hit her son Nusa furiously with a broomstick when he attempted dangerous acrobatic tricks on top of Will. Francisca asked herself, how can a mother be so cranky, so immature? To her daughters facing a similar dilemma of working motherhood in the age of neoliberalism, Francisca suggested that they should prioritize their motherly responsibilities. She remained a feminist as she urged her daughters, like her sons, to spend their precious youth in acquiring knowledge and skills. She encouraged them to bargain for a more equitable division of domestic labor with their husbands. However, she emphasized that her daughters should never become slaves to their jobs. Mirroring the neoliberal ideology that promoted the image of efficient, resourceful, entrepreneurial mother who found individual solutions to systematic problems, Francisca suggests that her daughters needed to manage their time between work and family wisely and rationally, not because it's good for their health, but because the harsh attitude of an overtired working mom will numb the child's sense of self-worth. In 2003, Francisca returned to Indonesia for the first time since 1965. Her husband, Supriyo, had passed away 1 year later, so Francisca could only meet him at his grave. Despite several reunions with her children and warm continuous communication with them and her grandchildren, Francisca continued to live in the Netherlands until her death in 2013. To conclude, the three phases Francisca experienced motherhood differently. Between the mid-1950s and early 1960s, Francisca's socioeconomic status enabled her to claim a professional life of her own. The culture of militant motherhood, which was promoted by the left-leaning Indonesian political forces in the early 1960s, affirmed the legitimacy of that life. Often strained and stressed, Francisca faced frequent burnouts as the wider society couldn't provide sufficient support to working mothers like her. In 1966, when she spoke on the stage of the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, she was a bereft wife and mother forced apart from her husband and children by Indonesia's anti-communist purge. In Mao's China, the cultural icon of mother warriors fighting for global revolution had once made Francisca feel that her personal sacrifices was worthwhile. 20 years later, when Francisca rebuilt her life as a refugee in Europe, child-centered motherhood, something she might have considered as bourgeoisie in the past, became the new social norm in the neoliberal era and burdened her with retrospective maternal guilt. The rise and decline of third world internationalism were inherently gender processes that resulted in gender consequences. So the Bandung era symbolized an aspirational opportunity for newly independent country to embrace a broadened definition of motherhood, not confined to biology or gender. So between the mid-1950s and 60s, there was greater social acceptance in both China and Indonesia of women's presence in the public sphere, as well as their absence from the everyday labor of childcare. Third world internationalism projected the vision of women's liberation, but failed to revolutionize motherhood by providing sufficient support for maternal labor. From the mid-1960s to the end of the Cold War, the cultural ideal of motherhood was narrowed down to a single maternal caregiver, although in practice, mothering labor had always been dispersed, delegated, and disaggregated. Despite the neoliberal myth that depicts childcare as all-encompassing, all-consumer responsibility of the birth mother, rarely have biological mothers been exclusively engaged in child rearing, and even more rarely have children been cared exclusively by their biological mother. For more than 30 years, Francisca was separated from her children. Yet her children were not without mothers. They were nurtured by an assemblage of other mothers consisting of kin and non-kin, male and female. Francisca herself also mothered other people's children. She was a caring auntie for offsprings of her fellow Indonesian exiles, and she was a loving grandmother. In the memories of her granddaughter, Lydia, who you see in the image here, her mother was Nila, Francisca's eldest daughter, who passed away when she was young. Francisca was a very special grandmother to Lydia, with whom she could be less respectful and more informal. Lydia would visit Francisca in the Netherlands almost every year during the late 1990s. Once Lydia was smoking in public, and there were strangers high on cannabis next to her. Francisca, usually a non-smoker, took a cigarette and smoked together and acting tough to protect her granddaughter. Lydia said it was a unique relationship. We can joke and she can act as if she's still young and I don't mind. Today, more mothers than ever before are living apart from their children. The statistical increase in maternal absence is another reason to study the historical and social construction of this concept. I myself was and am an absent mother when researching about Francisca. My children were cared for by another absent mother, an Indonesian domestic helper who left her own children behind in order to send remittances back home. Sociologists call this transnational movement of caregivers the global care chain. From the transnational activists in Cold War Afro-Asian movements to migrant workers in the contemporary global care chain, absent mothers pay them unpaid physical and emotional, remote and everyday maternal labor enable structural changes in the 20th century global political economy. Thank you so much, and I look forward to comments and questions from you.
What a great presentation. Thank you so much, Taomo. I had the honor to read the paper that Taomo wrote, which is what this talk is based on, last night before I went to bed.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, it was a good read. I was able to, from the beginning until the end, I didn't move, you know, it was 40 something pages, exactly because it's so captivating. And I think it took me another 30 minutes or even an hour to just regulate my breathing after reading it. And I think because of how personal it feels, this story of motherhood and the concept of maternal absence, but also it's personal, but also it's so captivating the way you write it. It's emotional and it's emotive, and I appreciate that because you have all of these materials, historical archives, right? And you could take a direction of writing about Fanggidaej from just her narrative of her historical journey, you know, as a politician. But instead, what you're doing is you're able to pay attention to these details, and especially the emotional detail, the anxiety, and capture that and actually explain that in the writing, which I think gives provide richness in the detail. But also for me, you are able then to humanize Fanggidaej in her human condition in a way that it makes her not just a famous politician at the time, but she is also an ordinary woman she is the product of her historical conditions too, that she is probably fighting as well against, right? So this actually put her in her human condition and capturing her own emotional struggle. And I think also this paper, what I really like from this paper is that not only that you are able to uncover the richness of the detail, but also you're able to put it in a broader context. And that's what the connection with Cultural Revolution, with Sukarto, order era, and the Asia-African movement, and then later on with the story of the exiled people, right? And also in that, while you're looking at the details, while you're looking at the broader multiple contexts and layers, you're able to trace them in terms of the evolution of this idea of motherhood. And you offer us this idea of maternal absence. And I hope we can have a conversation about this idea of maternal absences. So I'm gonna start by saying maybe we start with the historical context first, and then we then talk about the concept, more conceptual, theoretical, broader context. And the historical one, I think, is the most fascinating to me because my book that's just been published is a history of Indonesian left, when it first occurred in in colonial Indonesia in 1920s. So it's a part of a broader, the so-called Red Movement, which is, so I call it Red Movement because it's an umbrella. It's more like a popular front. So it's not just PKI, Indonesian Communist Party, but also other labor unions, other parties that align itself with this so-called Red Movement. And it was important because this is the first time that lower class, ordinary Indonesians mobilized in a popular radical movement. So this movement have been talked about many times by previous scholars, but what my book is doing is unearthing, the women activists, because previous historians talk about it from the male leader's perspective. So this book is about really unearthing these ordinary women, and I appreciate Taomo's article because she is able to then give us this story post-colonial, right, in the independence era. And so I guess from my perspective of the 1920s Red Movement, this idea of motherhood has actually been at the center of even this women's struggle, right? When women berpolitik, that's the term that they come up with. Berpolitik means when women got involved politically. As soon as they got involved politically, the first question they ask is about how motherhood was politicized and has been, But because these are chromo women, which is lower class women, they also said, we have a right to mother, but we could not because we have to work in factories, we have to work in plantation, right? So this is actually at the forefront of the feminist agenda at the time in 1920s. And something that I was wondering from your article is, could you tell us the feminist agenda, the broader feminist agenda in your period, in Fanggidaej's period? And what was, how is she responding to it? If you have anything to say, maybe we start with that.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your generous comments and that fascinating question. I think Margaret just asked a similar question when we were riding on the subway. The broader, kind of in the Indonesian context, I think Gowani was Indonesian women's movement, kind of as a wing to the Indonesian political party. They were advocating, this is not my research, I think it's mostly Sakia Wingararinga's research, advocating, for example, for menstrual leave, childcare at work, and also definitely ban on polygamy, right? But in her work, I think she traced this very kind of tragic or disappointing decline of feminist agenda as we near to, Sukarno's guided democracy, basically the end of liberal democracy in Indonesia. What I found interesting is that Francisca, I sense a kind of lukewarm attitude in Francisca toward women's issue. Like she was initially, when she was invited to join Gowani Indonesian women's movement, she actually declined. She said, like, I'm a business-like woman. I enjoy geopolitics, but I feel like I don't like to gossip. Finally, she joined like the Afro-Asia Women's Conference as a representative of Indonesia, probably because at that point, there are many shifts in the left-leaning international women's movement. At that point, I think in many socialist countries in the socialist bloc, the feminist agenda became subsumed, right, by the anti-imperialist agenda. So I think I really hope I would have this conversation with Francisca herself, like how she thought of herself as a woman. Right, and also, of course, the broader ideological tension between feminism and socialism.
Yeah, because I don't think she doesn't situate herself as a feminist.
That's a good question. I think she is. She was a feminist because she always believed that it's very important for women to be politic, to be educated, to have a professional life. But I didn't think she would pay so much attention to the day-to-day concrete labor that a woman need to bear. And part of it, when I presented this earlier, other colleagues raised this might be a class issue.
Yes.
Because she was brought up in this really elite environment. She didn't need to care, right? So.
Right. I'm just gonna move forward a topic that I think is the most interesting to me. And I think it will wake up people if people are sleepy. But this idea of sexuality, right?
Right.
Oh my God, reading the quotes that you provide, right? So you say clearly that motherhood is antithetical to sexuality. And you are able to capture that by showing to us direct quotes from her, that anxiety that she has when she fell in love with Ali in the quarantine. And she felt bad about falling for Ali, not because he's Chinese, because she's not allowed to fall in love, like to have a relationship with a Chinese person. It wasn't because of that, but because Ali was younger than her. And so to me, it's not logical reason. You know, if it's because she's Chinese, that's logical, it's not allowed. But she is anxious because he is younger. So already, you know, she knows that she break the rule, but it's because of the youthness. So there is actually another layer in here, which is about morality, about ethics, you know. And so when we talk about motherhood, this is not about politics. This is not just about physical. You know, when you're mothering somebody, it's physical. It's also about morality. And morality is something much more deeply driving your emotions, in my view. So it's a window to unravel all of these overlapping structures of feeling, right, that rule women's body and women's life. And then so while she is anxious because of her falling in love with Ali, I don't know what happened in that bedroom, you know, if Ali come to her bedroom a lot, right? But also it shows up when she responded to Godam's sexuality, homosexuality.
Yes.
You know, that she was so adamant about, like, she's pretty harsh to Godams that she just let him go. You know, after not seeing him for so many years, just letting go based on so there is this it's also, again, like I said, I mean, I like this, I mean, she is also, even though she's revolutionary, Fanggidaej is also a product of her own historical, you know, conditions. And so this guilt, it seems like she wasn't able to, I mean, that the guilt reflect that broader, you know, overlapping structures of feelings of the period about, sexuality.
Thank you so much for capturing that. And sorry to have.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. That reminded me, I should have mentioned. So there is this sociology, Gauze. She has this famous, like a best-selling book, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism.
Oh yeah, that book is amazing book. Yes, I hope you include that.
So socialism, socialist feminism, and sexuality. Another dimension of Francisca, which I didn't get to mention, is that she was raised in a Catholic family. So the family is from Timor-Leste. She's a Timorese. Maybe that Catholic upbringing, but she's Catholic and she's communist. That religion might also play a role in her feeling guilty about just having sexual feelings alone.
Yeah. And the fact that she has 7 kids.
7 kids, yeah. I also asked this question to her children, whether it's because she's Catholic, and they were like, oh, it's normal to have 7 kids.
She also enjoys sex. Like, just say that, you know, out loud. You know, I think
that could be
that's a possibility.
That's a possibility. I asked why, and I asked like whether it's because of the lack of contraception. They were like, oh, it's normal
to have 7 kids.
7 kids. Yeah.
One last question, and then we can open it up. I think that this time it's more conceptual. I just want to hear what you think about. I'm going to combine these 2 points. How do you see the contribution of this paper to feminism, to the study of feminist theory? I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of social reproduction theory that's currently is on the rise. You know, to really think of women's work as a form of labor. Sometimes they call it emotional labor, right? That emotions, mothering, nurturing, it's not compensated with money, but it's actually a form of labor too, right? And I think your idea of maternal absence is also very interesting to open up this question of emotions and and labor. But I do think, and this is the part that I feel I can relate so much. You mentioned about how you yourself have to be absent when you're working. I have a kid too, and I feel the same. But I think in an egalitarian society, this concept of maternal absence is something to be overcome, which means that it should no longer be relevant anymore to call somebody to be absent.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Because in that egalitarian society, we might be able to come up with a way to parent and nurture in a collective way, in a way that does not have to make women feel guilty for not parenting their kids. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. And so I was trained as a cohort diplomatic historian. That's the topic of my first book. As some of you might know, this is a very masculine field. Mostly male historians writing about elite male policymaker. I feel very marginalized. One way to cope with it is that you add women and you stir, right? There are women, definitely very few little women diplomats and policymakers. But I feel like that's kind of methodological impasse. So this piece, in a sense, is after finishing my first book, kind of how do I reconcile with myself being a mother and a woman working on Cold War diplomatic history, right? Can we see like Cold War, all these fireworks of geopolitics through a gender lens?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. All right, let's open it up to any other questions, Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what a wonderful presentation and a wonderful discussion. I was just curious, you mentioned the 510 place and that you had been there.
510,
And I
yes.
was curious who the other women were there. Were they also as active as she was? Who were they?
Gosh, I think the 510 is such an interesting place. So when I was in 2013, officially I wasn't allowed, but then like I think maternalism was playing there. So the deputy director of the place, she has a daughter of the same age as me. So she kind of, and her daughter was also studying abroad at that time as a PhD candidate at Cornell. So she kind of very much had this kind of connection with me. She smuggled me in. She said like, oh, I speak Bahasa Indonesia. I was the granddaughter of one of the exiles. So I went inside and there were 4 exiles still living there. So I can, so you remember that image I show, they were 2 women. So one woman is Bu Sukina. I don't have a picture of her here, but when I visited her, she was nearly 100-year-old. She was a woman leader, communist leader herself, but her husband was said to be the head of the East Java branch of the Indonesian Communist Party. By chance, he was in China receiving medical, kind of medical treatment. That's why they escaped 1965. She had children. At the time, she was still like, she's still very sharp and clear. She made all these embroideries, it's like embroidered, like
Confetti.
Yeah, confetti. Yes, confetti.
Yeah.
And I heard she has granddaughter and granddaughter living abroad outside of China. So by the time of 1985, what are you going to choose, right? For all these exiles, she's one of the few who chose to stay, but her children left her for I think was it for United States or for Australia, if I remember correctly. It's a very complicated issue with regard to the woman exile, because majority of exiles were men, right? The women, some were wives following their husbands. Very few were kind of activists on their own right. So I heard of a few who actually managed bring their children out from Indonesia and later migrated together from China to Sweden. But for other women in the exile community, it's a very tricky micro environment. Yeah, I met quite a few, like I met some second generation who grew up in that circle. And there were definitely cases of more senior members poaching on the second generation girls. Yeah, so because they were forbidden to have romantic relationship outside of their circle. It's not a complete answer, but I was telling Margaret, one direction for the book to go is also to talk more broadly about women in exile.
And were they all Indonesian, or were the Filipinos there
That's
as
a
well?
great question. I heard so when I visited, only 4 remained. But I heard from the Chinese staff member that it used to be Malaysian and Filipino as
Okay.
well before. Filipino, they are like, yes, yeah.
In
Because they used-
510.
No, I don't think in 510. I think the Filipinos were in a different place in Hunan, a neighboring province. So they all had their different spot. So when I went, if I could smuggling anecdote, there is another guy, Adi. So Adi used to be a very talented mathematician. He was studying math in Moscow. And then 65 happened. He was having some mental health issues. So he was basically brought back from Moscow by his friends. When I saw him, he's still like kind of very cheerful, roaming around, and people like, don't talk to him. He's he's not in like in some mind. But you definitely see they experience a lot.
Thank you.
Other questions? While we're waiting for questions.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's thanks for the question and thanks for the wonderful talk as always of yours. I have a follow-up question. I want to ask about also the sexual politics. Like, is there any difference between like, the Chinese Indonesians like, who are returnees to China at that time and Indonesians like Francisca in China? And so can the like the Chinese Indonesian returnees have sexual relationship with local Chinese people? You mentioned it a little bit just now, and also the point you mentioned about Francisca and people like her, like being both socially privileged and socially isolated in China is very interesting. Can you elaborate?
Yes, thank you so much, Tricia, for coming and for the always wonderful questions. The comparison between Chinese Indonesians and exile, that's a really interesting question. So the Chinese Indonesians who return around 100,000 between 1960s, roughly like around late 1950s, 1960s. 100,000 of them settled, most of them settled on different farms in like southern province, Guangdong, Hainan, the island. They are actually allowed to marry local. They're regarded as Chinese citizens, but it's not always easy. Sometimes there are stigmas associated with them. So they're regarded as not locals. They're kind of new, I would say stigma, but kind of mutual distrust. If you're on a farm, there's definitely kind of an invisible barrier between those who are returnees and those who are locals. So I don't see many cases when returnees marry local people. So I did field work on 5 different overseas, they're called overseas Chinese farms. Very interesting. I like among the people I interview, I heard way too many almost like hard to believe love story of teenage sweethearts. They reunited and got married and stayed for the rest of life, migrating from Indonesia to China. It was like, it's really hard to believe, like several cases. So they tend to marry within the group of returning Chinese Indonesians. And so that's quite different from the case of Indonesian exiles. Because I think the state, this is also, you go theoretical, it's also this theory of sexual containment, right? So Western countries, they obviously like during the Cold War, right, it's containment of homosexuality, or people who are childless, who doesn't behave in the like heterosexual ways, right? This is protection against communism for America. But in China, it's the same, right? So we're going to sexually contain these people who are on the margins of the society, whether it's returnees coming from a not strictly socialist country, all these, foreigners, although they are fellow communists.
How does, I wonder just with that question, actually, that's a great question. Go Cheng's Seng's book
Yes,
relates to this because
yeah.
he talked about the Peranakan, right?
Yeah.
And how there's a whole politic around, making sure to, this is where race come in, making sure to ensure purity of Chineseness. Do you think this also, it relates to that as well? That the Peranakan that returned still marry among each other instead of, opening it up with the Indonesian?
Right. I think that's definitely is this idea of a racial order, right? In China, I think in the case of the returnees and the communist exiles, part of maintaining a border, but also maintaining social control.
That's really fascinating. I want to pick up on the previous question a bit too. I was thinking somewhere at the very beginning, we talked about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and neoliberalism as all sort of containing similar gender ideologies in a way. And I'm wondering, whether there were differences and how you thought about this. You kind of pointed to one example here in terms of sexual containment. The other side of that to me was you presented a lot of the personal and the familial stories. And I just wondered, in her diaries, was there a sort of downplaying of politics in the latter part of her life because of history or because of choice, or was that an element of the diaries there as well?
Yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful question. Maybe I start with the second question. So there are lots of methodological discussions about how to read a diary, especially a diary written during the Cultural Revolution, right? So diary writing is a political action. So whether it's private or public, it's debatable, right? So famous like Lei Feng diary, it's not a private thing, it's for public consumption, right? He was upheld as a cultural icon of like this kind of altruism, the ultimate Maoist role model. So also our colleagues raised the question, was Francisca like thinking that someone will read her diary, right? She was in this leper's colony. She was writing it in Bahasa, Indonesia, but there were a few other Indonesian communist exiles who were also in the leper's colony. So was she writing it with the consciousness that somebody else might read it? And also the ultimate decisions, I still couldn't like figure out. So she moved a lot, right? Her diary was partially written in Havana, Cuba, in the lepers colony, in this 510 in Beijing. She kept everything. She meticulously curated her own archive. And then when she passed away, her children decided they couldn't bring everything back to Indonesia, so they donated to the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. So I asked them, like, why did you make this decision? And they were like, this is purely out of practicality. But I also wonder, was that Francisca's hope? Like, was she has a unique sense of historical consciousness, right? Was she really expecting like someone like me will read her story, right? And back to the first question, I do think all these regimes are oppressive in different ways. So Maoism, like totalitarian, it kind of helped Francisca in a way, right? So it's okay to be separated from your children. Family separation was, I was just telling Margaret, family separation was normalized during the Cultural Revolution. They're like youths were rusticated, they were sent down to the countryside. Right? So Francisca felt like this is not, I'm not alone, and my sacrifices were for a higher cost, right? But it also caused lots of emotional complications, right? So basically, it's a person's total submission of one's emotional ties, family loyalty to the party. Whereas neoliberalism, I think we're all here, like, and like the mom guilt is always here. It's always like, leaning in. You have to, you have to find your own personal solution to solve the systematic problems. There's a prioritization of problems.
And I had a follow-up question to that, which was like, how was her experience of neoliberalism in the 90s and after, specifically from Indonesia, from the Netherlands? Because we don't think of it as a super neoliberal place. We think of it as like socialist and state-funded childcare and healthcare and everything, right? And like, maybe that was part of why she wanted to go back there, like to return, not stay in Indonesia, but like how Netherlands influenced was her 90s.
Right. So that's an excellent question. Actually, that's one of the questions raised by the reviewer from my article. So in the revised version, I actually deleted neoliberalism because exactly of what you said. It's you're right. Like I think it's more the neoliberal culture as a whole.
Because like global vibes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the reviewer pointed out this is not a story about neoliberalism, but it's more about the decline of third world internationalism, right? That's what she felt like kind of third world internationalism. Yeah, so the kind of guilt the maternal guilt she felt was kind of an echo of the failure of the political cause she devoted herself to, right? Actually, Netherlands the Dutch government did take good care of her. And one of the reasons she chose not to return to Indonesia is because later she became a naturalized Dutch citizen. It was a very difficult choice for her because she was staunchly anti-colonial. Although Dutch was actually her first language, that's her mother tongue. She only learned Bahasa Indonesia in her 20s. Yeah, so she was purely Dutch educated. But she became anti-colonial. However, when she joined Dutch citizenship, she felt like it's almost like a humiliation, but she felt like she didn't have any other choice. And because she had Dutch citizenship, she had healthcare. She was actually, in the end, she died at like kind of a government facility where they took for elderly care. And it's for that reason, she felt like if she returned to Indonesia, it would add more financial burden to her children.
Not what I was thinking of. Oh, it's a question on the line? Yeah, do that first. No, go ahead. Take the online question.
Would you like to read it?
Okay,
Sorry.
yeah, we have a question from someone named An Wen. Hi, my name is An, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at NYU. Thank you so much for the talk. It was so rich with not just the archival research, but also information on the key concepts and how they figured in historical context in both Indonesia and China. I especially appreciate your topic as the subject of third world internationalism is predominantly framed as a paternalistic and pedagogical project. I was wondering if you could speak more on this. How do you think of this lens of motherhood, of personal history, and to change current understandings of third world internationalism and decolonization?
Internationalism. That's a great question. Probably blanking. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne, for this very generous remark, and also for this question of internationalism. I do think that paternalistic, you're right. I think there is a growing literature on third world women's movement, particularly, like the foundational work, Darker Nations. What's his name? The author did mention that women are on the front line of anti-colonial struggles, although I think he also pointed out the fall of third world nationalism to a certain degree was also the male leaders' failure to engage with women. And recently there is also growing literature for example, by Sloan Lewis.
Wilden.
Weydon was also gender
Oh,
part.
the African Assyrian, how do you say, Afro-Asian movement, right? I don't know if he mentioned women, but that's one of the burgeoning literature these days on that topic.
Gender, yeah, and also Caroline Stowe and
Colonel Scotland, yeah.
Celine Lewis' book,
yes.
Lives of Afro-Asia. So they brought in not just add women in, but also use these concepts of like sentiments, affect, to analyze Afro-Asian movement, definitely. And I hope your work also like look at third world internationalism from a gender perspective. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work. Yes,
My bad.
I have two questions and they're related because my question is for the latter part of her life, was she still writing in her diary? So that's great because I'm wondering, you do a great job and it's so interesting the way she actually felt some solace from being in Maoist Cultural Revolution because everybody were absent mothers and so it was normalized. So that's so interesting. So later, and also you say that she had surrendered herself to the revolutionary project of the Communist Party, which I find that you portray that total surrender very well. So when she goes to the Netherlands and she sees what's going on in the world, does she distance herself from this surrender to the Communist Party? And the second part of that question is, did she consider herself, you call her a revolutionary and her identity as a revolutionary was important to her, or was it anti-colonial that was a better description of her identity? And how did those evolve in her later writings in the Netherlands? So both.
Right. Such wonderful questions, Margaret. So so I made a huge spreadsheet over all her diary entries. They kind of come in different phases. So like when she was in the lepers colony, that was a period when she wrote intensively. She wrote in her diary really intensively. Then when she first arrived in the Netherlands, she also wrote intensively. So one of the most memorable entries I read was like this 1985. She was in, she has so much kind of difficulty adjusting to the new life. Like she was in this guest house. There were lots of migrants from different countries. And then she feel like very horrified. This is the first time she's living by herself in an apartment building. She heard people coming and going. So like even, mastering all the courage to go outside, do my laundry, go to the bathroom, go to the kitchen, that's very challenging. And then it's under these circumstances, she wrote like, oh, today a friend told me that I should write a memoir, but I thought, if I just write everything with myself at the front of center, that's meaningless. I want to be a warm, cheerful, but a kind of like audience cheering on for the main character. I want to have that outsider perspective on my own life. Only with that can one create a meaningful history. So she I think she is a very perceptive woman thinker. And did she distance herself from communism? I think exactly. June 4th, 1989. This is I heard from Dede Utomo. Dr. Dede Utomo is an Indonesian professor and also like a very recognized political activist. So he was once very close to the Fanggidaej family in the Netherlands. And he mentioned to me like Francisco became disillusioned with communism after China's Tiananmen crackdown. I think ultimately she identified with anti-colonial cause, and nowadays I heard she became a cultural icon. There are like T-shirts with her image, and a famous word from her autobiography called "Revolusi adalah pulang." So revolution is returning home.
And how relevant it is for today as well. If you think about it in terms of home and returning to home. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Violet. I am a graduate student in NYU's English department. I really enjoyed your talk about how like there's effective labor and like tracing the effective labor that she experienced over the years. I am curious about this question about maternal absence in neoliberal service economy, especially in like Southeast Asian context. I was wondering how the rhetoric of nationalism and also border control still echoes that kind of like Cold War anxiety around what kind of like ideal family structure is and also maternal role in like like service economy countries like Singapore or cities like Hong Kong or Malaysia and the Philippines.
Okay, thank you so much, Melanie, for the question. I'm not an expert, so this is about contemporary issue, right? So I'm not an expert on the topic, but I can share just a few works I have read recently. So there's definitely kind of a similar biopolitics. I mean, my knowledge is totally anecdotal. For example, in the Singaporean context, what they call like domestic workers is subjected to blood examination every 6 months, including STD tests and pregnancy tests. So if they ever fall pregnant, even if this is a legitimate child, she's married, her husband is around, they will be deported, and the employer will be fined a huge fees. So you're right. It's a total irony of the neoliberal political economy, right? So these helpers are providing not just the physical labor, but also affective emotional labor to the children. But on the other hand, the Singapore government want to draw this line very clearly, right? So that's a topic I've been following closely, although I myself do not do research on that, but happy to share more literature.
I actually remember a senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore who had an Indonesian helper and who would not give her a day off. She didn't have to work, but she couldn't go out of the house because he was afraid she would get pregnant. Isn't that awful?
Wow. All the more reason to say how important Taomo's work is. This is such an important and amazing contribution to the field and to our understanding about the role of motherhood and women and everything. Thank you so much to Taomo. Thank you so much for the great and lively discussion and for all of your questions. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
That really was.